Welcome to day 173 on the trail. We have three readings for today from 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 24, Judges 21, verses 1 through 25, and 2 Maccabees chapter 7, verses 1 through 42. Our reading from 2 Maccabees today is especially difficult. Following the words of encouragement in chapter 6, the author guides us through one of the most dreadful stories in the entire book. In this story, we find a powerful dichotomy between the faithfulness of a Jewish mother and her 7 sons, and the exceptionally ruthless oppression and wickedness of Antiochus IV. As we have discussed previously, in the mid-2nd century, Antiochus IV Epiphanes unleashed a period of grievous religious tyranny upon the Jewish people. Up to this point in 2 Maccabees, we have witnessed the national or political implications of Antiochus's reign. Now, here in chapter 7, we see the impact of Antiochus's brutality in the lives of ordinary families and people. Within this story, we find two means by which Antiochus attempts to demand adherence to his edicts and to spread Hellenism. The first, and most obvious, is the use of torture, humiliation, and pain. However, when this proves fruitless and only demonstrates the faithfulness of the sons, Antiochus resorts to the opposite extreme. Instead of torture, Antiochus offers to make the 7th son rich and powerful in his kingdom if he will simply bend a knee to Antiochus's will. At this offer, the mother leans in and powerfully says to her son, "My son, have pity on me. I carried you 9 months in my womb and nursed you for 3 years, and have reared you and brought you up to this point in your life, and have taken care of you. I beg you, my child, to look at the heaven and the earth and see everything that is in them, and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed. And in the same way, the human race came into being. Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers. Accept death, so that in God's mercy I may get you back again along with your brothers." In this final statement from the mother, we find a hope in the resurrection to eternal life. This is something to keep in mind as we continue reading the New Testament. Also, as we prepare for readings from Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation, which speak of God's people facing times of great tribulation, 2 Maccabees helps provide personal stories and background to those in the midst of persecution, injustice, and suffering. Some of the questions that they were asking are not unfamiliar to us when we face challenging seasons in our lives. We ask questions like, where is God in times of suffering and injustice? Did we do something wrong? Or did we not do something that we should have done that led to the situation? When will God return to save us? And what do we do while we wait with hope? During our times of suffering and difficulty, these stories remind us that we are not alone. We are reminded of times when God's people were facing similar circumstances. And perhaps we can find hope in these stories that recount God's faithfulness in the midst of the chaos of life that this world can bring. Turning now to the New Testament. In our final reading from 1 Corinthians, we find Paul's final greetings, as is his practice. This is one of the great reminders that these are in fact letters written to people that Paul cared deeply about. While we can learn from Paul's writings, we must also remember that we have an opportunity to experience the relationships that Paul had with followers of Christ. Today, I would like also to take this opportunity to briefly talk about the relationship between 1st and 2nd Corinthians and how the two letters from Paul actually work together. While scholars differ on the timeline, it may be possible to piece together some elements from these letters that might help us better to understand them. As we mentioned in our introduction to 1 Corinthians, prior to writing the letter that we know today as 1 Corinthians, Paul had written an initial letter to the congregation mentioned in chapter 5, verse 9. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons. Some scholars believe that a fragment of this first letter, which we will call letter A, survives in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 to chapter 7, verse 1, since it deals with a similar topic. However, this might not necessarily be the case. Paul's second letter, which we will call letter B, would be the letter of 1 Corinthians as it is known today, which was believed to have been written around AD 54 from Ephesus. Here, Paul intends to stay in Ephesus for a while before heading on to Macedonia and Corinth. Meanwhile, Timothy is sent ahead to the Corinthian church. Part of Paul's motivation for writing 1 Corinthians is to answer disputed matters from a letter he had received back from the Corinthians. We see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which I wrote you. It appears that 1 Corinthians didn't go over very well with the Corinthians, and Paul learns of it. In response, Paul may have sailed directly from Ephesus to Corinth to deal with the dispute. This may have been the painful visit he refers to in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. So I made up my mind not to make you another painful visit. For if I caused you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? Therefore, this painful visit would have not been Paul's first visit, but his second. We do not have a record of this visit in Acts, but that is not surprising. Acts was written with a specific purpose and theme, not to provide a detailed accounting of Paul's journeys. Then, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 14 and 13, verse 1, Paul says that he's planning to visit the Corinthians for a third time. Here I am, ready to come to you this third time. And again, this is the third time I'm coming to you. Now, it is during his second visit that Paul was spurned after seeking obedience from the Corinthian church. In response, Paul writes what he has called his letter of tears, which is referenced in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 4. For I wrote to you out of much distress and anguish of heart, with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. This third letter, or the letter of tears, which we will call letter C, is now lost. While Paul seems to still be correcting the Corinthians, he also demonstrates a deep love for them. Now, some scholars suggest that this letter, letter C, may be partially contained in 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13, since the language and style is different from the rest of 2 Corinthians. Again, this may not necessarily be the case, and is hard to prove with any certainty. Paul then writes 2 Corinthians when he learns that his letter of tears has made an impact. Paul appears to be overjoyed when he hears the news. Now, regarding 2 Corinthians in particular, there are many historical and literary problems within the letter itself. So it is possible that what we have today may be an edited collection of several notes from Paul. For example, 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 9 are peaceful and conciliatory, while chapters 10 through 13 are more harsh and defensive. But again, this is not conclusive. The shift in tone between chapters 9 and 10 may simply reflect a stylistic or rhetorical difference rather than separate letters. Now, regardless of the composition of 2 Corinthians or the precise historical situation, it is clear that Paul deeply loved and cared about the members of the Corinthian church. Despite their divisions and their attraction to other teachers, Paul continues to work toward reconciliation and establishing a peaceful, loving relationship with them. In our world today, which is more likely to ignore, avoid, or cancel those with whom we disagree, Paul's desperate work to reconciliation and building strong relationships in the midst of conflict is a sorely needed reminder. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.